Hello everyone, Mike Levin, out risking his neck to walk this guy. February 26, 2015, I guess around 7:30 a.m., bringing you the secret untold story of Commodore computers. Something near and dear to my heart, which I mention in a lot of my videos. It basically created the home computer industry, and if not Commodore, then a guy named Chuck Peddle, who was closely involved in Commodore. And it is really the story of two guys. Once upon a time, there was a Holocaust survivor named Jack Tramiel, who was in the calculator business, competing in the heyday of HP calculators when they were the big thing before computers. Computers started to come on the scene. Jack realized there was money in it, hired a gentleman named Chuck Peddle, who designed the cheapest microprocessor on the market from a company called MOS Technologies, M-O-S, in Norristown, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, where I grew up. And the magic thing here was that the chip, the 6502, was a clone of a $300 Motorola chip called the 6800. They had different internals, but a lot of machine instruction compatibility. The bottom line of all this is that it was $25 compared to the $300 Motorola chip. And so Tramiel saw opportunity in this, hired the guy who designed that chip to design a whole computer, and that was called the Commodore PET. And in practice, Tramiel and Peddle became almost like partners, but in reality, when push came to shove, Tramiel called the shots, and it got such that Commodore bought so many chips from the MOS factory that MOS ran out of money, and to save them, Tramiel bought the company, hence Commodore owning its own microprocessor company, MOS Technologies. And that started a long tradition of Commodore using as many of its own parts as possible in building its computers. For example, they owned a file cabinet company, so the Commodore PET was made from bent sheet metal, unlike many of the plastic housing computers of its day. Like the Apple II, which happened also to use the MOS technology 6502 and later the 6510 chips. And the Commodore 64, first the VIC-20, then the Commodore 64 came on the scene, which used these same processor chips, and everyone else was jumping on the bandwagon. There were a few other things out there, like the Z80 processor from Zilog, but for the most part, Commodore had the market for inexpensive CPUs for home computers, because you couldn't use the $300 ones in those days. You had to use the $25 one, or how expensive was your device going to be? And that made Commodore something like the Intel of its day, and this made the rest of the industry, including Apple, very nervous. And so a bunch of companies got together and used one of these open sourced RISC processor designs out there and designed their own processor on it. And those companies were Acorn, kind of like the Commodore of the UK, and a chip designer called VLSI, and lo and behold, Apple Computers. And they designed something called the ARM processor. And so the ARM processor was a direct industry response to Commodore's incredible dominance in the marketplace. And that kind of went into sleeper mode for many, many years. It might have been like 25 years, and was used in such oddball cases as the Apple Newton. But it kept being developed, and it kept being used in more and more embedded things, competing with some of the other similar cheap embedded processors of the day, like the MIPS processor, which is used, I think, to this day in a bunch of Wi-Fi routers. But ARM made more and more designs. They never manufactured the thing themselves. They were a fabless technology company, meaning they didn't do fabrication themselves like Intel, who made the chips and sold the chips. ARM just sold the designs. And so what you use every day with your cell phone that has a little ARM processor in it is Apple's and a few other companies like Acorn's response to Commodore's rising dominance in the industry. And of course, Commodore went away. There's a lot to the story there. That won't be part one of the secret untold stories of Commodore. I'll cover that stuff later. That's where my heart really lives, which is the Amiga computer, in which Atari enters the picture, or at least a lot of Atari's hardware engineers, or one in particular. The Raspberry Pi uses the ARM processor, brought down to $35. Again, the price point was $25 that they were trying to bring that thing out. It's in the direct lineage, admittedly, by the creator of the Raspberry Pi, the designer of its system on a chip, the founder of its foundation, the employee of Broadcom. His name is Eben Upton. And in discussion with him, he actually told me, yes, this is directly in the spirit and the lineage of the Commodore 64 and the BBC Micro. So everyone jumping on the Raspberry Pi bandwagon these days, you are using something directly inspired and designed to rekindle that 80s feeling when computers were these wonderful devices you could, get under the hood of, understand things down to the metal, do unlimited projects on, and they would be relatively cheap. So, you could, have them. High levels of accessibility. Cheaper to own a Raspberry Pi these days than a textbook about computers. So anyway, I always find it interesting that people, lose sight of this. They like to downplay things like the Raspberry Pi, downplay its significance. And, when you flash back 3 years ago, it's just really hard to believe that there was a device with that level of capabilities for $35 and just $25 without networking. And today with the Raspberry Pi 2, which I just unboxed, they upgraded the hardware capabilities using much more modern designs from ARM, 4 processors instead of 1, and probably using a lot of their clout now that they moved 5 million of these units. So the foundation could, probably get a much better deal from ARM to bring such wonderful technology to the masses. And hopefully what we've seen with the Raspberry Pi so far is just the beginning of a turnaround, a revolution in technology education, because people talk about computer literacy and they think about it from this consumer perspective, knowing how to do video editing and how to use a mouse, and well, that's no different than watching TV. It's just a little bit more creative. You want to start digging down through the levels, down into it, and seeing what makes it work, and start creating some of the programs that let you be creative, and not just consuming programs that let you be creative. And so I guess that's a little bit of what I'm trying to do with my little mission here. And thanks for listening to me. This has been the Secret Untold Stories of Commodore, Part 1. Jack Tramiel and Chuck Peddle. Thanks for joining me. Hope to talk to you soon. And don't forget to subscribe.